Welcome to GVN Interview, your home for conversations with some of the best in film, television, media, and literature. On today's show, we welcome multi-talented journalist and media host, Dometi Pongo. Now here's your host, Martin Sexton.
Welcome to this special edition of GVN Interview. I am your host, Martin, and on today's show, we are talking to award-winning journalist and media host, Dometi Pongo. Dometi is the host for a CBS News 48-hour produced 6-episode podcast about the 1987 unresolved murder case of Ruthie Mae McCoy and Candyman, the true story behind the bathroom mirror murder. So let's welcome the multi-talented Dometi Pongo to GVN Interview. Thanks for sharing a bit of your time with us, Dometi. How are we doing today?
Of course, I'm well, Martin. How are you?
I'm doing good. All right. Okay. So as is the norm for most of my interviews, I want to start a little bit about your background. So when did you take an interest in journalism and media, and whose work might have inspired you to pursue that vocation?
Well, I'm a Chicago guy. I'm the son of Ghanaian immigrants. You know, my parents came here in the 70s, here meaning America. And I had actually, as a kid, I wanted to be a rapper. As a lot of kids want to be in a band or do music. I was one of those. And that's what I was known for throughout most of my high school and childhood. I was the guy with the pen, the kids banging on the table, rapping together and all of that. And life happened, and I ended up being a business analyst and majoring in economics and hated it and said, let me find my way back to the arts. Found my way back in Chicago, starting over from scratch. And I interned at a radio station called WVON on Chicago's South Side. And from there, that internship turned into a full-time job. And I haven't left the industry since.
So, of course, I lived in South Haven before, which is right across the Lake Michigan from Chicago. Almost every station I ever listened to was the Chicago station because the South Haven station was an AM radio station and they played nothing but old music and I couldn't stand it. So I listened to WLS out of Chicago most of the time. Okay.
Oh, yeah, legendary state. So you'll appreciate this. I ended up working at WGN before I moved on to MTV and Paramount.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, so of course, WGN all really meant to me was the Cubs. So that's what. Okay, so as I was doing some research, I noticed your mantra for life: bring everything you are to everything you do. What was the origin of that credo, and what does it mean to you, and how do you feel it shaped your life and career?
Man, I'm glad you asked me that. I always forget it's in my bio, and I say, dang, who thought of that? That's pretty good. It actually came from working in corporate America. And, I was at Target headquarters, which had a great corporate culture, but Minneapolis, Minnesota isn't a very diverse city. And the corporate structure coming, from somebody who's actually an artist at his heart, it demands that you leave a lot of yourself at home. So you put on the suit, the things that you find interesting don't necessarily make for water cooler talk, right? Like everybody's not listening to the same mixtapes I'm listening to. And so, when I finally started to make deeper connections, I found that it was when I was using my personal life experiences to inform me about how the target consumer might behave, or just making personal connections with somebody who I didn't think might be in the same music I'm into. And I realized that I was shrinking myself by not bringing my full self to everything I'm doing. And so when I ended up transitioning to media, one of the earliest conversations I had with my former employer at that first station was, okay, what name do you want to go by? I'm like, well, my name is Dometi, so I'm gonna go by Dometi. She was like, well, it might be difficult for the listeners to pronounce. You might want to change it. And I went home and talked to my dad about it. And he was like, do what you got to do to keep the job. But his eyes said something different, and I took that and I said, you know what? If I'd rather fail as myself than succeed as anybody else. So I'm gonna bring myself to the show. Fast forward a couple years later, the station ended up doing a promotion where they had different hosts take listeners on a trip, and they had my listeners go to Africa because by my name, you knew I was African. So, my name and where I'm from ends up opening opportunities for me, just like being from Chicago brought about Candyman. So that's kind of where it came from.
Okay. It's funny you're talking about your name. I said, of course, they told me how to pronounce your name, and I was sitting there looking at it. So I eventually went to listen to your little blurb on the podcast, and you said your name. I said, okay, well, must have it right. I'll go play that. Okay. So your expertise in social media has been instrumental in helping businesses increase their reach through your Pongo strategy group. So how'd you get involved in that? And just say I'm a client, and what would your pitch be to me to tell me how that would benefit my business?
Oh, that's a good one. So Pongo Strategy Group came out of just necessity. So while I was working and freelance reporting here, working full-time as a news director here, was programming an internet station here, I needed an LLC, but I needed a conduit that would help me service a lot of the organizations I was working with. For example, I found that when I was a news director at WVON, a lot of community organizations would reach out for press and their press releases weren't all the way together, or their social media presence, they might have had a lot of followers because their cause was a unifying element, but the actual quality of what was posted on the page didn't match the cause. And so I just started the firm just to help community organizations kind of make it easier to report on them. I said, listen, if all of your information is on your website, you have everything you need. You can start a podcast about the causes that are important to you, and I can help you do it. So that's kind of how it started out. One of my clients was Black and Bold Coffee. They later on went on to be acquired by Deion Sanders. They're now in Target selling their products. So if I were pitching to GVN, I think you guys got it figured out. So I don't know what I can say that you aren't already doing. But I'd say, listen, just have me interview with Martin, and maybe that'll help both of us out. That would be my pitch.
Good answer. Good answer. Okay. Okay, so let's get into the new podcast, Candyman: The True Story Behind the Bathroom Mirror Murder. So, how did you get involved in the project, and how did CBS News and 48 Hours sell you on the story and the concept?
Well, it didn't take much selling. Actually, you want the short version or the long version?
Well, you said we got time, so you can go the long version. That's
Okay.
fine.
All right. Well, this podcast was actually 3 years in the making.
Oh,
So, Morgan Canty and a producer at 48 Hours CBS reached out actually about a different story. They're working on a true crime story, and they needed a journalist who had been following the case, but it wasn't a case I'd been following. But in that conversation, I talked to her and another producer, and I just started talking about what I'm interested in. I said, hey, these are the things that I do. This is what I'm interested in. This is who I am. If you guys, want to holler back at me, let me know. And, I think nothing of it. A little time passes. They come back and let me know that they're working on this really cool idea around Candyman. I read Steve Bagheera's article in the Chicago Reporter, and mind you, I don't like horror movies, so I hadn't seen Candyman yet. So I just knew about it, just being it's an urban legend. It's a cult classic. So I just knew about the film, but I hadn't watched the movie yet. And so I started talking to different folks at Paramount and the podcast CBS World and Megan Marcus and all of these brilliant VPs. And I said, hey, listen, I'm here whenever you guys want to do it. And some years went past, some corporate things going on above my pay grade. And it wasn't until this year that we finally were able to, get it going. And it didn't take much convincing. I was there in 2021, and it finally came together, and here we are.
it's funny you mentioned the Steve Bagheera because, be honest with you, I was not familiar with the story at all. So I started doing some research and I ran into Steve Bagheera's article. They came in through the bathroom mirror, a murder in the project. And uh, if someone's interested in this story, besides watching your podcast, I would recommend reading his article because he pretty much covers pretty much everything about it. And he also has a follow-up article about basically talking about the trials and everything. So it's well worth the read if you want to read it. Okay, so like I said, I was left with many questions after reading his article. Said, so were you familiar with the story at all before you read Steve's article?
Yeah, no, I had, I heard murmurings that, just being from Chicago, I knew it was set in Chicago and that there were elements of Cabrini Green, the project building, which is also the same projects where Good Times is set, the TV show. And so, you knew that there was some elements that brought in, but I didn't know it had any connections to anything true. And actually, Steve Bagheera, you talk about like leaving with, wanting to know more. We interview Steve on the podcast and have a very long conversation about what he discovered. He kind of walks us through the case. We talked to a detective on the original case. And I guess I should talk about it. What we end up learning is that Ruthie Mae McCoy was actually murdered. A 52-year-old Black woman was murdered in a project building called Abbott Homes. Abbott Homes wasn't where the movie is set, but what essentially happens, there's this design flaw that allows for two apartments to be connected through a chasm at the medicine cabinet within your bathroom mirror. So essentially, her apartment was a normal apartment. There was an apartment on the other side of it, and some men or multiple men, or maybe one, we still don't know. It's still
Right.
unsolved. Climbed through the bathroom mirror and assaulted and ostensibly robbed her. Later on, Bernard Rose, who was working on his new film, which turned out to be Candyman, comes to Chicago. He based the film on a short story that he'd read, and he took these real life elements from this murder and made it a part of the film. And the comparisons are striking. And what was concerning to me was the fact that he never in the film is there like a rest in peace, or never in the press run did you hear anything about this true story. So it felt like an erasure of this real life person, whose tragedy inspired this film. There was a lawsuit that came out. It was a lot of fallout afterward
Oh,
that would have allowed for great conversation. And so, we felt that was missing. So that's why we built the podcast.
I say, well, see, that's interesting. Of course, and like I said, and he really, I mean, like I said, when the female lead is looking through microfiche, one of the articles she sees in the microfiche is basically the title of Steve Bagheera's second follow-up. I mean, it's almost word for word. So I mean,
Almost
it's
word for word.
right.
Yes.
So there's more than a relationship there. Okay, so just out of curiosity, because I'm not, from I don't do your job. But when you're going to host a podcast, is it important for you to feel a connection to the material when you do it, or is it in the end is it just a job? I guess it depends on the individual.
I was just, I kid you not. I was, putting together, I'm posting some promotional material for the podcast, and I was putting together a caption, and I deleted it because it was too emotional. I was like, I'm talking too much. Let me just post the dang thing and keep going. But I literally was thinking about just how blessed I am to do work that I'm passionate about. I don't want to just go to work. That's like, I did that in corporate America. I know what that I get depressed. It's not for me. So I have to care about the story I'm telling. Now, does that mean every single red carpet interview is an artist that I love and listen to all the time? No, because I also do red carpets for MTV. But I have to have some connection to what I'm doing, more or less, in order to be connected. But that's especially true when it comes to true crime, because these are real lives. These are real people. These are folks whose stories you want to get correct. These are people who can reach out to you and say, hey, you got that wrong, or you didn't do this with care and respect. And so every story, that I'm doing has to have some entry point that allows me to connect with the story, the subject matter, or the person. And I think that's how I bring my full self to it. Even with this podcast, that there are varying levels of involvement a host can have. You can pop in and read the scripts, or you can choose the music, and down to the theme song. I beatboxed one of the melodies for the theme song, and that's how Cedric Wilson, our composer, put it in. So I'm hands-on. That's what gives me life. That's what wakes me up. That's what gets me excited.
Excellent. Okay, so now, like I said, as I was reading Steve Bagheera's article, of course, like I said, it gave me lots of questions. Of course, one of the first questions is what were the police doing, delaying to go into her apartment? I said, because she called 911 and they eventually showed, but they also got two other 911 calls talking about shots in the apartment. Why? I mean, that seems like to me like any other place or maybe any other person, they would have burst right through the door. But when they were talking gunshots, but it took them 3 days to find the poor woman, which just seems ridiculous to me. I mean, did you address these concerns in the podcast?
That is one of the saddest things about the story. Yeah, we dive all the way. That's episode 3. You're gonna enjoy listening to that, and well, not enjoy, because some of it might make you upset, might anger you, because it is sad. What ends up happening is a woman Ruthie Mae calls 911 and says they're trying to come through my bathroom mirror. Somebody's coming in. And understandably, the dispatcher doesn't fully understand what she's saying. And we have the transcripts from that actual 911 call, and we have actors play out that scenario on the podcast. And you can tell the dispatcher is confused and can't really make out what's actually happening. So to the authorities' credit, right? That sounds a little crazy, but you would show up at least. So the police finally show up. There were 4 shots, as you mentioned, and we dive all the way into the timeline. The short answer is Envy's pardon me. The short answer is in these project buildings, the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, has maintenance men that have keys to the apartment. And they're reluctant to break down doors because the tenants will get upset. Repairs are slow in the building. And there were also alleged reports of hoax calls coming from project buildings. So that is the official reason that's been given by the police department, these host calls, Chicago Housing Authority not being able to open these doors and damage tenants' apartment. If I could use an educated guess, being from Chicago, having seen the inequities in terms of how our communities are serviced, I don't think there was much care for this neighborhood. I can't imagine that in another part of town, a call would happen like that, and folks would do everything they could immediately to get that person. And so when you listen to the podcast, you'll start hearing about these issues of systemic inequities from the way the building was managed all the way to how police engaged with this building and with its residents. So it's a lot that goes into it. But the short answer is I think the management didn't want to break down the person's door. And even though there were reports of gunshots, I don't think they fully understood what had happened.
And of course, in his follow-up article, he talks about, that 3 day delay, the chances are because of the wound she had, even if they came in right in, they probably would not be able to save her. But what they could have done is to cordon off her apartment and keep evidence from getting out of the apartment. They had 3 days for people to wander in and out of there. And perhaps the gentleman that they had indicted for the crimes, it might have been proven that they did it. But as it turned out, of course, they didn't have enough evidence and people walking all through the apartment. So, of course, they were both acquitted. And I found it interesting, and I don't know if you touch on this or not, and I may be saying too much, but in the second article,
I would say these were spoilers, but it's a 30-year-old crime, so
right.
That's
kind of what I'm relying on here. But the judge in the second, because one person did the jury trial, the other one did a bench trial, and the judge, acquitted him, but he put the blame on the police by not going in there and cordoning off the apartment and preserving evidence, which I found very interesting. But who's to say, as you said, this is an unresolved crime. But it's been 37 years since Ruthie's murder. Do you think, like I said, and that brings up another point. Hardly anybody covered this crime. I mean, it was no one wrote any, other than Steve, wrote any articles about it. And of course, their saying was, well, people are getting killed around here all the time. It's not even a story. You think after 37 years, is that still the case in project buildings and such? Do people just take murder that lightly?
Well, if you look at what's going on with how Chicago is positioned in the media today, I mean, it's a talking point amongst folks running for president. It's portrayed in some respects as this lawless city, or that all of this crime is happening in Chicago. And what, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, who actually is a guest on the podcast, she said, listen, we always talk about the symptoms, but we don't interrogate the conditions that allow the symptoms to persist, right? We don't talk about what creates an environment. Because what's interesting about the Cabrini Green neighborhood, which is where the film is set, it's on the near north side of the city, and every adjacent neighborhood, well, the buildings are gone now, but every neighborhood around it is affluent. And they have all of the services, whether it's not a food desert, just literally blocks away in white neighborhoods of Chicago, which is a deeply segregated city, all of the amenities and resources that allow for a deeper quality of life are present. So, crime, at least in America, can usually be tethered to poverty. And a lot of the poverty conditions are things that are outside of the residents' control, that is, at the behest of the city. When in the podcast, we get into the history of the first Chicago Housing Authority president, which is Charles Swibell. Swibell was later accused, he was never convicted, but he was accused of funneling millions of dollars from the CHA using his own personal private real estate connections, benefiting personally instead of the Chicago Housing Authority, right? So these buildings were in lack. How do you not have a situation where folks are, trying to find different ways to make money, where drugs are, we're talking about the late 80s, the early 90s, drugs, crime, all of these things, the crack epidemic, all of it becomes a powder keg. And so, today a lot has changed for the better, but in some respects, a lot hasn't changed. Crime is still rampant in these areas. Chicago is still deeply segregated. We actually looked at the Chicago Urban League statistic that looked at the wage gap, the median income gap between white Chicago residents and black residents. It was somewhere in the mid 30K was how much annually black families made. White families made somewhere in the mid 80, right? A
Right.
$50,000 gap. And the gap had widened from this year versus in 1987. So, when you have that deep of inequity, when you have a segregated city, a lot of things are going to happen. So, it's a sad state of affairs, honestly, and that's why I think these stories, like what we talk about in this podcast, are so important.
Okay, so you're a seasoned pro at this. So when you work on a story like this, and you're talking about it, is it difficult for you to separate your own opinions and feelings as you approach it, or do you embrace those opinions as reasons why the stories might interest other listeners?
I was just reading. I was doing a class on this, and I was reading the elements of journalism, and it had an interesting quote in there by Bill Kovac. It says, "Journalists aren't biased, so their methods have to be." Well, wait, journalists aren't objective, so their methods have to be, right? So we're all human beings, and even when you're telling the story objectively, the people you choose to interview, can reveal your personal connection or your personal bias. There are elements of who we are as human beings, as citizens of the same world that we're reporting on, that color your perspective. And that's why your methods have to be objective. So what I do as a journalist is I don't shy away from that. I'm going to tell you from the jump, I'm from Chicago, was raised on the South Side, went to high school in the South suburbs. I've seen multiple facets of life, and this is the perspective I'm coming from. Now, here are the objective facts. And here's also why I'm presenting these set of objective facts. And if you want to learn more, here's where you can read more. That's my MO. So I bring my full self, bring everything I am to everything I'm doing. So I bring myself to it, but I don't let my opinion cloud the facts that I present or the way I analyze and interpret those facts, because facts are inconvenient things if you have a narrative, and you can't come into a story with a narrative. Even in this podcast, as you said, the murder's unsolved, but the detective on the story fully believes that the two men that were originally tried, he fully believes they did it. And if that is his valid perspective, we're going to present that. And then we're also going to present the perspective of the life that these men were living. One was a teenager at the time. And, one accuses the police of coercing his witness statement, right? So
Right.
we're going to give you all of that. And, my interactions with police have nothing to do with Anthony Menina's excellent work as an investigator. And so, all of those things just help to inform what questions I ask and where I look, because I have the perspective to know where to go and what the police were, accused of doing at that time. So I know what questions to ask. And, I try to bring everything with me in that reporting.
Okay, now that actually brings up a point. It said, it said the podcast is scripted, but when you're doing the interviews, did they give you questions to ask, or did you come up with questions of your own?
Oh, me and my producers it's like a collaborative effort. And so, for some of them, even when I was getting up to speed with the case, my producer, Alex Schumann, who wrote the episodes as well, he, you know, writes out the questions. And then once you get in front of somebody, as you just start going. And once you're intimately connected with the case, you just start digging into it and getting into feeding your own curiosity. With Bernard Rose, as you'll hear in I think it's episode 5, we talked to Bernard, or episode 4. Um, I've got a set of questions, but his answers aren't what I expect them to be. And so we just start riffing, And so it's a mix of freestyle, it's a collaborative effort, because the 48-hour CBS team, they've been doing this since the late 80s. It's one of the most, if you're talking true crime, And you're talking quality true crime, longest running, one of the longest running shows. And Judy Tygar, who executive produced it at its inception, is still there. You don't make too many edits to that team. You learn from that team. And so it's collaborative, but I'm learning a lot from them too.
Your enthusiasm is contagious, I got to tell you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you talked a little bit about the urban legend of the Candyman in the film. Why do you think urban legends still hold such a fascination for people and audiences?
Man, I love your questions because you're talking about stuff that I just talked about. Bernard Rose and I talked about this, and I'll give you his theory because I don't know the answer, but his theory is that, and it's something that he pulled from The Forbidden, Clive Barker's book, which served as
Right.
the basis or inspiration for Candyman the movie. His theory is that people, especially in dire circumstances, need something to believe that their situation could be worse. So if you're living in these tenements and these project buildings, the idea of an urban legend, places, I guess the myth of it allows you something to give you a reprieve from your present situation. I think folks love urban legends just because for the same reason we love storytelling. It's just interesting. Mythology is interesting, and in the same way, religion, except it's faith-based. So for those who believe it is factual, is all just interesting. So I think that's why we hold on to it, man. I think and with urban legends, you can put a little bit, it's like a game of telephone. You put a little bit of sauce on it. Every detail, every time you tell another person, there's another detail. Which is interesting, kind of how this movie gets made. All these elements of Ruthie Mae's story get congealed into this story, and then the name changes a little bit, and that headline, like you mentioned earlier, changes, and then the project building changes. It's almost like the movie itself is its own urban legend.
It's funny you talked about, it's right, because I've heard urban legends, right, where you can ask 5 different people and get 5 different versions of the same story. Okay, so as I mentioned in the opening, this will be a 6-episode podcast. So
Yes.
when all is said and done, what message are you still hoping that listeners leave the story with?
Well, I want people to look at what stories don't get told and why. Later on, you find out about stories and you wonder, why didn't I know about this sooner? An example of this is Marcellus, the individual in St. Louis, or Missouri rather, who was sentenced to death and was executed recently. And according to all reports, there was some problems with the trial, and there was quite a bit of reasonable doubt that he actually committed the crime. But by the time I heard of the story, and I'm someone who voraciously looks at the news, by the time I was tapped in, it was 3 days out from his execution, and the governor had a chance to stay it, but didn't. I bring that up because there are so many stories that we don't know about, that we don't pay attention to, and all it takes is a spotlight on it for us to talk about it. There's a chance we wouldn't be talking about Ruthie Mae McCoy's death had it not been for this film. And if we're not talking about her, who else aren't we talking about? And that case, the tragedy that she went through ended up resulting in a lawsuit because of the design of the project buildings. And later on, there were subsequent repairs made to how these buildings were made. And now today in Chicago, a lot of these project buildings have been torn down. So one story can have this ripple effect that affects an entire city and its residents, for the better in a lot of cases. And so I would like for people in your own community, after listening to this podcast, to look at how things are today in your community and kind of think through, how did we get here? And that's the importance of history. And so, and last point I'll end on is in 2021, Jordan Peele executive produced, the Nia DaCosta directed third or fourth film of Candyman, the retelling of Candyman, and they address a lot of what wasn't addressed in the previous movie. Gentrification gets talked about. There's the police element and how, the new Candyman engages with the cops. And so, now I think we're in a space where, more Black and diverse creators have an opportunity to add nuance to these stories so that it's not just entertainment. It lets us think more deeply about the world around us. And so that's what I hope listeners do after listening to this show.
Excellent. All right. Well, I do want to thank you again, Dometi, for spending some time with us. But before I let you go, I want to give you one last time to share about the podcast and where listeners can go to get it. And of course, any other new projects you might have coming up.
A big thank you to GVN for having me. This is a great conversation. I appreciate it. The podcast is available every Thursday if you're a Wondery Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts, or if you're a 48 hours plus subscriber, you get the episodes a week early. They drop every Thursday. Episode 1 is out right now. And yeah, you can check it out on all podcast platforms. As far as keeping up with me, you can follow me at Dometi on all platforms. I'm also a host at MTV. I hosted the pre-show for the VMAs, and I got a couple of new showcases and artist interviews coming up. So if true crime's your thing, follow me on 48 Hours. And if music's your thing, follow me at MTV.
All right. So, well, I feel special now. I know a celebrity. Okay. All right. All right. Well, I thank you much, and I will be listening to this podcast because now, like I said, your enthusiasm alone has got me intrigued. That and of course all the research I've done into it, and I hopefully get a chance to talk to you again in the future.
Yeah, I would love to hear what you think after, because a lot of the questions you have are questions I hope we answer on the podcast. So I can't wait to hear what you think about it, and I think you'll like it.
I think that I may be coming after you again at the end, so we can have another discussion.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching this edition of GVN Interview, your home for conversations with some of the best in film, television, media, and literature. GVN Interview is a production of Geek Vibes Nation.